All right, so we're at the Expedition Medicine.
Am I looking at you?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'll stand right.
Okay.
I'll be close to the camera, so it doesn't matter.
Be easier to talk to you.
At the Expedition Medicine National Conference with one of my favorite people, Dr. Howard Donner. And Howard's going to just talk a little bit about himself. We'll ask him some questions about himself and how he got into wilderness medicine. As someone who has been around wilderness medicine for many years and co-author of the Field Guide to Wilderness Medicine, and he lectures at a lot of different conferences, I just love hearing his stories about wilderness medicine and how he got into it, because it's such a great field, and a lot of people are interested in, maybe making it more of a career focus. So Howard, to begin with, how did you get into this? And I know you were a river guide and you did all this stuff in the outdoors before you were in medicine, but how did you get into wilderness medicine?
And by the way, this is off camera, but do you want sound bites, or do you want?
You can just talk. Yeah.
Okay.
Then, yeah.
So it's funny because at a lot of these conferences, doctors come up to me and they go, "Oh, I'd like to get into wilderness medicine. How did you get into wilderness medicine?" Mm-hmm. And for me, it's funny to hear that, because it was the other way around for me. I wasn't a physician looking to get into wilderness medicine. I was a river guide and a mountain guide in those days, mostly a backcountry ski guide and river guide, and became really interested in rescue, and started teaching first aid and doing some rescue, and I was teaching some survival courses as part of my backcountry stuff. I worked at Lassen Park in those days, the national park up in Northern California. And as a river guide during the summer, I started getting so interested in hypothermia and frostbite and stuff that I was dealing with in my survival classes. I'd be on the river and I'd talk to doctors, a lot of doctors typically going down rivers.
Right.
And I'd go, "Hey, I have a question for you about frostbite." And they'd always go, "Oh, you're a pre-med student?" And I'd go, "No, I'm studying film." And they'd go, "Why are you so interested in all this medicine?" And I would say, "Well, I teach a lot of survival medicine," and they kept saying, you should go to medical school. You should just."
Right.
And so at one point I just decided, it was so interesting to me and I was so into it. I thought, maybe I should go to medical school. And the truth is, this is a dark secret, but I truly believed I would never get into medical school. I think had I believed that I could get into medical school as sort of a film student river guide, I probably wouldn't have done it.
Right.
It was, I think in my mind, more of a game, well, I'm going to become a doctor.
It sounds good.
Yeah.
So you started off doing that, and you were into film, and you were into like the outdoorsy stuff first. And I know when you were, as a medical student, you were teaching kind of quasi wilderness medicine classes or something?
Oh, no. I knew that wilderness medicine was going to be. I'm not trying to. Let me start this again. In those early days, even before I was a medical student, I was really into wilderness medicine, and it wasn't really much of a field then.
Right. Oh,
There was a book by Jim Wilkerson, Medicine for Mountaineering, I think it was called.
Yep.
And it still is out there, and Wilkerson's still.
Book.
Yeah. But there was really nothing. There was a couple books and a few English books by a guy named Ward in England, and then Wilkerson's book, and it wasn't really a field. And I was working for the Park Service, and I was a pre-med student by then, and I invited Howard Backer.
Howard. Yeah.
He'd been a friend and a mentor, and he's not that much older than me, but in those days he seemed like kind of an old man, almost like another generation.
Right.
He's now probably 4 years older than me.
Right.
But he was a doctor, and I was a lowly pre-med student. And I said, I'm working up at the park. I was working a season as a patrol ranger volunteer before med school. And I said, let's go up to Lassen and put on a wilderness medicine course. So my sister, who's an artist, designed these kind of groovy posters, that were all line drawing illustrations of mountain medicine, and I forget, they had probably an eagle and I don't know. So we went up to teach this wilderness medicine course, and it was incredibly successful. We had 3 people.
And that was the beginning. And that's when you knew that this was really going to take off.
So, literally 3 people. I remember we were in this little ranger room, I forget where, and there was 3 people sitting there.
That's great.
And so Howard came all the way up for that. And but shortly after that, I wasn't deterred, and I was a med student at UC Davis. I finally got in at UC, and they had, obviously, like all universities, a big continuing education department.
Right.
And I went to the CME people there, and they had a department and a dean. And I said, "Hi, I'm Howard Donner. I think it was a first-year medical student.
Wow.
I'm a first-year medical student, and I really think you should do wilderness medicine courses." They're going, "What?" And I said, "Wilderness medicine. It's a field."
No idea.
You know, and they're going, "Listen, you know, you're way too wimpy to put on a course. You know, you're a lowly first-year medicine.
Right,
you know?
right.
So you go find a real doctor who can help you with this."
Right.
So I went to these people and I said, the people that were in CME, the dean told me I couldn't do it.
Right.
And I said, "Look, I need to find a wilderness medicine doctor, but I don't really know any that are local." I
Right.
knew Howard and Gil Roberts, I think,
Yeah.
and Charlie Houston and a few people,
Right.
but I didn't know anybody local. And they said,
Right.
"Well, there's this guy Joe Serra who went on a trek in the Karakoram, and he did support medicine for this trek in the Karakoram." So in those days, that was all the credentials you needed. You're a doctor.
And you've done something
You did
outside the
something
hospital.
outside
You
the
went hiking.
hospital. You're a wilderness medicine expert.
There you go.
So I called Joe and I said, "Joe, you don't know me. I'm a medical student. I need a real doctor to help me with this." He goes, "Yeah, well, sounds great, sure." So he came to me and said, "You'll never get any of these famous people to come because nobody's ever heard of your course." And you know. So I remember the first person I called, the person I wanted more than anybody in those days, was a guy named Finlay Russell. Do you know who he is?
I've heard the name.
He was in those days the undisputed international expert on snake bites. And I don't just mean North American pit viper invention.
Right.
I mean worldwide exotic snakes, wherever you went, he was the guy. And I called him, I said, "Hey, look, I'm a first-year med student. We're running this wilderness medicine course, which is going to be an academic, continuing medical education course. And is there any way you could come?" And this was before email and everything. I just got on the phone and I just called him. And he goes, "Yeah, sure, I'll come." And I called Hackett.
Wow.
And I called Paul Auerbach, who had just finished his residency, and Ed Gear, and a guy named Cameron Banks, who was a Colt guy up in Oregon,
Right.
and Charlie Houston.
Right.
And I forget a bunch of people, and we put on workshops. And the cool thing about that conference was that it was before wilderness medicine really caught on, so it was very down home. We held it at Stanford Sierra Camp, and we all had our meals together. In this
What year was this approximately, you think?
81, maybe.
Wow.
And I think it was the first. I may be wrong, but I believe it was the first wilderness medicine course in the U.S. for continuing medical education. Actually directed towards doctors.
That's amazing. What's interesting is that I can remember going to try to find a dive medicine book, even when I was in college, and not being able to find one that I really liked. And it's in the last 20 years, you've got all these textbooks now, and you have all these conferences and courses, and to see how it's developed has been really amazing. So, okay, so you did that, and then you went on and you were finished your medical training, and you do a lot of things now. As far as you're into all sorts of things: a commercial pilot, filmmaking, speaking. How have you been able to balance all these different things? And we talked about this, I remember, a while back, and you were talking about how you live very frugally, and you've just kind of, followed your interest into a variety of areas. But, so many physicians, they're strapped down by debt, and they have these, huge commitments of time. And, I think it would be probably good to touch on that and how you've been able to sort of organize your life so that you could pursue your passions a little bit. So how do you do that, or how did you do that?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think that I've been able to balance everything, and it might appear that I have, but I never feel like my life is balanced. It always feels sort of tipped to one side or the other.
Right.
But I will say that it's kind of the way I think I approach my house. I don't keep my house really clean all the time, but I'll let it go downhill for a day or two, and then I'll go crazy and clean it. Right. Maybe that's how my life has been. I went through med school, and I was done. I just said, I can't do this. I just literally cannot do this anymore. I'd gone from being a river guide all summer and a mountain guide during the winter. During the winter, and ski guide, and suddenly I'm just inside. I said, I'm out. I'm going to leave after medical school. And everyone said, you can't just quit after medical school. You need to do your internship.
Right.
So I did my internship. I worked at Highland for a year, and then I spent 4 years where I did nothing but wilderness medicine.
Wow.
And it's all I did. You know, it's where I worked on some research protocols like Operation Everest too.
Yeah.
And I went to Kanchenjunga, and I worked up on Denali for the first time.
Wow, a great
I worked
experience.
for the Himalayan Rescue Association for the first time, and just kept doing stuff like that. And I did that for 4 years. And then all of my friends, people like Paul Auerbach,
Right.
who I prefer not to call a mentor, I call him a tour mentor, said, Howard, it's great you're doing all this stuff, but you have to become a real doctor. So
Right.
I actually put off my residency for 4 years just so I could spend 4 years in the field.
And you basically did a fellowship in wilderness medicine before there was things like that, a 4-year fellowship.
Yeah,
I mean, you went from place to place, and now there's a real fellowship in wilderness medicine at Stanford, and I think there's some others that are looking into it. But
Right.
wow, that's amazing. So we've talked about that, and then I guess for other people who are curious about wilderness medicine or who want to follow in your footsteps, what advice would you have? So I get this all the time, and people come up to me and say, how do I get into it? So
Right.
what practical steps would you say?
Yeah.
So you're on the outside looking in, and you want to be involved in wilderness medicine. What do you do?
Yeah, I think I can try to answer that. By the way, I just moved. Am I okay with you?
Perfect.
People come up to me all the time at conferences. It's probably the single most frequent question that people ask me, especially young folks, often residents, and they go, I want to get into wilderness medicine. And it is, I think, one of the hardest questions there is to answer.
Yep.
I mean, there could be some good answers that there aren't, and the good answers would be that there would be some kind of database or something where people would database skills versus needs, and it would be like a high-level dating service for expedition doctors.
I can work on that.
No, actually, if you ever want to, I have a lot of ideas, but I would never.
Well, for a future interview.
Seriously. But I realized that I was completely inadequate at answering that question. And then one day I realized the reason it's such a daunting question is because wilderness medicine is such a huge and in some ways nebulous field. Yep. Somebody says, I want to get into wilderness medicine. The reason that's overwhelming is, what is wilderness medicine?
Right.
It's not like there's wilderness medicine. Wilderness medicine could mean you are working on snakebite antivenom, venom, and you're actually working on the molecular biology of snakebite venoms. It could mean you're doing rescue work in the Grand Tetons or in Yosemite. It could mean you're doing missionary medical field work, military field work. It goes on and on and on. You could be doing high altitude research with Hackett. You could be working. You understand that. What is wilderness medicine?
Right.
So what I tell people is, it's not that you have to be singular in your direction in life. It's fine to take a direction and then change your direction.
Right.
I have no problem with going in one direction, deciding it's not for you, and going in another direction.
Right.
But I tell people, don't think of wilderness medicine as a field, wilderness medicine. Imagine yourself doing something specific.
Right.
And that is, you want to do rescue medicine because you're a rock climber. You want to do hyperbaric medicine because you're a diver. You want to do altitude medicine because you're interested in altitude and the science of pulmonary mechanics at altitude and such. So then find the best person out there that's doing it. So you want to do altitude. So go call Peter Hackett. He's in Telluride. Email him and start pestering him. Tell him you want to work for him, and don't scare him by saying you need money. and just say, look, I want to work for you as an intern or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And start gaining experience by volunteering initially.
Yeah.
And put yourself around somebody that's doing what you want to do.
Right.
And visualize where you want to end up. So if you want to end up like Peter Hackett, hang out with Peter Hackett. If you want to end up, you picture yourself as some, rescue doctor hanging off the end of a rope on a helicopter, then go to Denali or go to the Tetons or go to Yosemite or go someplace where they're doing that and immerse yourself in it and volunteer with search and rescue or work at the Yosemite Valley Medical Center if you're an emergency doctor, and then volunteer with search and rescue there or whatever it takes. Put yourself into the environment doing exactly what you want to do, and then you're going to start getting experience.
Right.
The other thing, this separate soundbite here, but the other thing is I think about this a lot. It's funny. It'll sound a bit self-deprecating, and I don't mean it that way. I mean, I'm proud of my career in wilderness medicine. But to be honest with you, I don't like it when people say to be honest, because it implies that they're not honest the rest of the time. But if I have to be honest with myself, I think the person that I am, Howard Donner, this so-called wilderness medicine expert, I don't think I could make it into the field of wilderness medicine right now, because my strength, my real expertise is that I'm such a generalist. You know that. You can ask me to talk about anything,
Right.
and I'll make it up. And nowadays, I think to become a wilderness medicine expert, you have to be a person like Peter Hackett, who's published 100 papers, and who is very directed in their research and what they do.
Right.
Somebody like me that says, hey, I know a lot about wilderness medicine because I'm a guide and I've studied it and I'm really interested and I can talk about anything. I don't think they find their way into the wilderness medicine circuit. And I think I was able to because I started at a time when somebody like me
That's a good point.
could make a name for themselves.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying you shouldn't be like me. You shouldn't just be a generalist. There's a lot to be said for being a generalist. But I'm saying if I was starting out now and I wanted to become an expert in wilderness medicine in a different age than I started, I would look for fields that were underserved.
Right.
And I'll give you an example. This is just one example.
Okay.
I think if you wanted to become an instant expert in wilderness medicine, frostbite,
Yeah.
there are no experts. And so, I'm asked to give talks on frostbite all the time, and I consider myself somebody who's seen maybe 100 or 200 cases and dealt with them in the field, but I'm not an expert. A lot of surgeons come in and give talks on frostbite, but they haven't seen that many. If you went up to Alaska and worked with a guy like O'Malley in Anchorage, who sees all these cases coming off Denali, and you really studied it and started giving some talks and wrote a chapter here or there, pretty soon you'd be the frostbite guy, because there are none.
Right.
And so, find maybe a slightly more esoteric field and really become well-versed in it.
Yeah, develop your name in some area, that in some specific area. Okay, so switching gears, this will be our last question. We have another conference coming up in November, Medical Fusion, and you're going to be talking about your filmmaking and some of the things that you did working with the Telluride Film Festival. Starting to sweat. So tell us, I get a lot of questions. What is the Medical Fusion Conference? What are you going to be doing there, et cetera, et cetera? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about at Medical Fusion and what the Telluride Film Festival is, and kind of a little bit about filmmaking, and then that'll be it. That's a lot of questions.
No, I can do that. Well, I think people in general, and I suppose that includes doctors. Doctors are people. I think most people, including doctors, have this notion that they're locked into things, and the locks are really self-imposed.
Yeah.
And I noticed. I've given one talk to a graduating high school class. My career as a graduation speaker was limited to one high school. But I remember going there and I was thinking, what am I going to talk about?
Yeah.
And I just decided that I was going to tell them not to take advice. It's not that advice is bad, but I noticed that the advice I got throughout my medical training wasn't always bad, but the unspoken message when you're given advice by your advisors is be like me, do what I'm doing.
Right.
So if you go to an academic advisor, what do you think they're going to tell you to do?
Yeah.
They're going to tell you to... So if you go to an academic advisor, they're going to tell you to stay in academics. They're going to tell you to become like them. They might not say, be like me.
Right.
But the unspoken message is,
Be like me.
be like me.
Right.
So I think a lot of doctors fall into that. This is what you're supposed to be. This is what most of your colleagues are doing. And therefore, that's the mold. That's who you are. And I think it's important to remember, whether you're 20 years old or 50 years old or 70 years old, that A, you're the primary person locking you into whatever it is you're doing.
Yep.
Now, there are monetary issues. I mean, we all have to make a living, unless you have a huge trust fund like I know you do.
Yeah.
we have to make money, so you can't just
Right.
go off and do what you want to do.
Right.
But usually there's more flexibility than you imagine if you're willing to
Right.
maybe live a slightly reduced lifestyle in
Right.
terms of your luxuries. And the other thing is, it was important. Oh, and the other thing is that I think somebody tells us, or somehow we get the idea when we're younger, that who we are when we're 20 is who we are when we're 30.
Right.
Or who we are when we're 40. It's kind of, we become this person and that's who we are. But there's nothing wrong with reinventing yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think who you are when you're a 30-year-old resident may be very different than who you are as a 50-year-old clinician.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with it. And if you can embrace that and ask yourself if you're willing to accept that you might be different, you might have different interests, and it might be time to try a few different ideas out.
Right. Right. And so as far as the filmmaking thing, that's one of the areas that you're passionate about, obviously, and enjoy that. And I mean, is it more or less a focus now, or is it kind of a side thing now for you? Where are you in the...
Right. Well, so you asked me, how I balance my life. So there was a period of about 4 years where I was making at least one film, at least 2 films a year. Mm-hmm. I think important films twice a year. I've just gone through a hiatus where I haven't made any films, but next week I'm leaving here. The day after I leave here, I'm going to Canada to start brainstorming a big project. And with any luck, it'll come to fruition. And by the time Medical Fusion happens, I'll be working on that. But with film being as sort of ephemeral as it is, I never like to assume that any project is going to go forward until it really happens.
Right, right. Well, great. Well, thanks, Howard. We appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you in November at the Medical Fusion Conference.
Good, well, thanks.